Room 39 boarding school was a nightmare. Even more so because we did not get to choose our roommates. So, as I unpacked my boxes for the upcoming school year, I could only pray fervently that the roommate I got would mind their own business and leave me be. Last year I was fortunate enough to be placed with someone who couldn't care less about my existence. He was a fellow freshman named Greg who spent most of his time on eccentric science experiments with his club mates. Normally I would have taken an interest in this subject, but he was almost never in our room, so our conversations were limited. I placed the last of my textbooks on the shelves provided by Walton Preparatory. The room was cramped with 2 single beds, some shelves, built-in wooden cabinets, and desks for each. It was not roomy, but it sufficed. And besides, I was a desk-to-bed and vice versa kind of person. I took my academics seriously and I knew it was the primary purpose of boarding school. So I may focus on my education and make my middle-class parents' money worthwhile. As I put the last of my stuff on the shelf, the doorknob turned and in came a tall, muscular blonde. Immediately I recognized him as one of the young star players of Walton Prep. Neil Webley. My green eyes met his intense brown ones and he gave me a weak smile. Likely to mask his disappointment that he was paired with someone so lame and unpopular. "Hey," he said softly as he wheeled his suitcase and bags in. He placed them on his bed and extended his hand towards me. Neil Webley. Troy Fowler. We did not utter another word after that, and I knew then that this was going to be one hell of a year. We unpacked our bags in silence, with only the occasional banging of the closet door or stationery being arranged in the desk. I could totally deal with the deafening silence. I actually preferred it. I could pretend I did not have the most sought-after athlete in school as my roommate, and he could ignore my existence as did almost everyone in the prep except my few friends and the occasional bully. Once I finished unpacking, I plopped on my bed and started browsing through some of my textbooks for the coming school year. I wanted to read ahead but was much too exhausted with unpacking. So I decided to just roughly skim the pages. As I leaned against my headboard, "You like poetry?" Neil Webley's deep voice interrupted my lazy reading. He was peering over my shelf and then shifted his gaze at me. I nodded and I was positive I was betrayed. I did not expect to change another word for him tonight. If I was being honest. Figures. Cool that you have Robert Browning on your shelf. You read about him? My question. My interest now piqued because of his knowledge of one of my favorite authors. He flashed me a charming smile. "Don't look so surprised. We athletes can read too. You know," he teased. "But yeah, I read his work and his wife's over the summer. I'm not into poetry, but I recently took interest in it." He knew Elizabeth Barrett Browning. That was floored, to say the least. Perhaps I had my own prejudices about this man and every other athlete in Walton. "In fact, what's your favorite then?" I inquired. "Of all of their work? Probably Elizabeth Browning's How'd I Love Thee. You're a romantic then?" "Hush, no one needs to know." He smiled. "Just intriguing. Really, how someone can feel so strongly about another." I had to give credit to him. He had much more substance than I had anticipated. Maybe this year would not be too bad after all. It was not until 3 days until the school year that Neil and I had our first public interaction. While we occasionally spoke during the rare times he was in the room while I was still awake, we mostly kept to ourselves. He got up early in the morning for practice and usually arrived at night. I studied late into the night at times but would normally be fast asleep when he got back. On that Wednesday, however, I happened to pass his friend's table at lunch. "Now your roommate's Neil," one of the jocks asked, not even bothering to lower his volume and unabashedly talking about me while I walked past. Neil must have nodded but not utter a word. "Lame. No wonder you usually stay out of your room then. Afraid you'll soon start reciting the periodic table and Shakespeare in your sleep if you get locked up in a room with him." Another one joked. Laughs interrupted from that table and it took all the guts in me to keep walking towards the opposite part of the canteen where my best friends Clark and Jacob awaited me. When I glanced back at their table, though, my heart could not help but sink as I watched Neil join along in the banter. Banter where I was the centerpiece. I was disappointed but certainly not surprised. In the 4 corners of our dorm room we may be cordial, but in the greater scheme of things, this was still Walton where social hierarchies were in place. Unfortunately for me, the Neil Webley I knew and the one who secretly loved poetry and geeked over Browning with me was not the Neil Webley everyone else knew. In their eyes, I was the lame, nerdy roommate and he was the star athlete who was most unfortunate to be rooming with me. They lost their first game of the season and watched with my friends Clark and Jacob, and they were floored to find out that for once in my life I was intrigued by basketball. Despite the incident at the cafeteria with Neil and his friends, I was amazed that I was able to withstand the awkwardness in our room. Shortly after he apologized, not bothering to elaborate or even look into my eyes, I did not reply and simply pretended not to hear. You should know that despite what his friends call my nerdiness and lameness, I was a human being with feelings nonetheless. I went to his basketball game to support him. Walton played terribly for the most part, with Neil missing shots that should have been easy points for him. Despite their subpar display, they managed to close up the game to just 2 points, but subsequently lost when Neil missed the game winner. He looked devastated and disappointment was heavy in the air. When he entered our room hours after their loss, he was clearly worn down. He hung his head low, and for the first time since I knew him, he actually looked weak and vulnerable. "Watched your game. Chins up. You did all you could," I mumbled after a long while of silence. He flashed a signature smirk, but I could tell it was forced this time around and his smile did not quite reach his eyes. He plopped down on his bed and I faced him while I was laying on mine. "I played terribly but thanks," he replied. We were silent for a while, but for once there was not awkward. It was comfortable, as if our souls were speaking to each other without needing words. "I'm scared, Troy. For once in my life, I'm terrified that I won't be able to live up to the hype of the fans, the expectations of the school, my parents. All my life all I've ever wanted was to be a basketball star, and now that it's within my reach, I don't know if I'm good enough." Neil Webley, scared, must be hearing this wrong, I replied as I sat up on my bed, got up and plopped myself next to him on his bed. There was something about him opening up to me that made me gravitate towards him. As if I had been intrigued about his character all my life and now was the chance for me to really get to know him. "I don't know if I can even survive the season, let alone be the captain. I think you're being a bit too hard on yourself." "I mean, you said it. You're the captain for a reason. Imagine the first ever sophomore to captain the basketball team. That in itself is a feat. One bad game should not define your self-worth. Neil, you have your team backing you up, believing in you too." "You?" he asked, turning his face towards me abruptly and momentarily taking me back. "Do you believe in me?" He asked this with such pleading eyes that I could not help but feel for him. I fell for him because I knew how much expectations could bring you down. All my life I have lived in constant fear of disappointing my parents with my grades. I was terrified of being subpar, of not reaching my full academic potential. "I do, and you should too. You're a lot better than you give yourself credit for. You're too harsh on yourself sometimes. You know, you're a human and of course you will have bad days. Even MJ had bad days." "Neil," he chuckled, probably surprised that I even knew who Michael Jordan was. "You're the first person to ever tell me I'm too harsh on myself. People normally just tell me to suck it up and man up." I shook my head vigorously. "That's the thing. I too swiftly judged athletes like you. I mean, it was the first time I ever saw you vulnerable really, and it made me think I cared for you. You know, I don't know you well, but I do care for you and I want you to see your worth just as much as I see you." He did not reply after that but continued staring at my orbs. I brazenly stared back as the tension in the air reached its peak. We moved in sync and before I knew it, our lips were unashamedly crashed against one another's. The nights that followed that fateful kiss were a bliss. Our room was a sanctuary for both of us. Neither of us knew where we stood. I was positive, but that notion did not keep us from relishing the company of each other. We did not kiss again and neither did we talk about it. But we spoke of much deeper things and got to know each other in levels I never would have dreamed of. I found out that his mom was a writer. But when she died when he was 12, he shunned the idea of literature. Only in the summer when he discovered some of his mother's unknown works did he take an interest in poetry and even started crafting his own short stories inspired by the memory of his mother. In turn, I read him some of my favorite poems and mustered up the courage to read one of my own personal work. But I knew this was merely a bubble. Outside of our dorm room, we were strangers in the eyes of the rest of Walton Prep. There was no universe in which we belonged together. So imagine my surprise when the following week a similar situation occurred in the cafeteria. I suppose the rest of Walton Prep team were regaining their usual swagger because one of the juniors in the team purposely collided with me, spilling the carton of milk on my tray and causing the apple and sandwich to fall on the floor. "Out of the way, nerd," exclaimed the jock. I was as red as a tomato, especially with the rest of the group's laughter reverberating through the cafeteria. I was just about to squat to pick up my food when I heard a commanding voice. "That's enough," said Neil sternly. "What has he done to you anyways? Leave him alone." The laughter stopped at once and the rest of the group seemed to have followed the order of their captain except one. The junior who had deliberately bumped into me moments ago glared at Neil and shook his head vigorously. "I think the real question is what has he done to you, Webley? You're now defending some lame-ass kid." Neil stood from his chair and approached the junior whom I recognize as Carl Anderson and one of the starting 5 of the Walton Prep Tigers. "Who are you calling a lame kid, huh? That man, Troy Fowler, has more balls than you will ever have. Sure, you can shoot a few buckets. But didn't you pay his friend Lewis to get your chemistry homework done?" Carl looked even angrier upon hearing this. "Turning on a teammate because of your nerd roommate. Huh? I see how it is. No wonder you've been so out of focus during games. Someone's been keeping you preoccupied with that." He made an exit and the rest of the team went back to lunch as though this was a normal occurrence. I picked up my apple and sandwich before discarding my empty milk carton when I saw Neil approaching. "Hey, you good?" he asked. I nodded and flashed him a smile. "Thank you for standing up to me." He smiled back and looked at me dead in the eyes and all I could see was sincerity of the Neil Webley. The same Neil Webley in the dorm room was here now. "Don't thank me. I should have done that a long time ago. Sorry for not doing it earlier. But I promise you I won't let anything happen to you now." "Tough night?" I asked, closing the book that I was reading in bed, placed it on my bedside table and watched as Neil removed his coat and plopped down on his bed. He nodded and stared at me. "Yeah, Anderson's giving me a tough time. He ratted out to the coach and said that you were distracting me from performing well this season." My heart sunk. Neil had been one of my motivations and he was the inspiration for a lot of the work I was doing at the moment. I wrote a poem about our newfound friendship that was going to be published in the Walton paper. Even in literature class my professor had commented for some new exceptional essays about friendship, romance, and inspiration, all because of Neil. The last thing I wanted to do was be the exact opposite to him. I did not want to hold him back from reaching his potential, especially in basketball. "Am I?" I mustered up the courage to ask. "Quite the opposite. No one says words to me like you do. No one believes as me as much as you do. Don't think for a second that I will let anyone's judgment get in the way of our." He lingered and I knew that he did not know what to make our arrangement. "Friendship?" I completed for him. He repeated, although I could not help but hear the doubt in his voice. "Friendship then." He leaned in and before we knew it we were kissing feverishly, this time around with much more urgency and strength. We were like two animals in the wild, hungry, passionate, and intimate as he laid me in his bed for that night and cuddled with me through the wee hours of the morning. I knew one thing was for sure. This was not just a friendship. "Man, how do you do this?" ranted Neil frustratedly as he slammed his pencil on his desk and looked over to me for help. I was in the middle of an advanced math problem set, but he was struggling with his physics homework, and when Neil Webley gave you puppy eyes, you just would not be able to resist. I took his pencil from him and impatiently explained the lesson. I could feel his intent gaze on me the whole time and I applauded my ability to not combust at the sight of those eyes. "What?" I finally asked. "Are you even listening? I like looking at you," he said so casually as though it was merely an observation. "I like looking at you. Especially when you speak of poetry or science or anything really." I raised my eyebrow and returned his gaze. "Neil," I started, "I can't go on like this. Not knowing where we stand. No, we're friends. But this feeling between us. How am I supposed to sit through moments like this and believe we're nothing more?" "What do you mean nothing more?" "You and I," he gestured towards the two of us. "We're everything." I could feel my eyes start to water and I took his hand in mine. It was so quiet that I could hear our breathing. It seemed as though the world had stopped for us, and if I went any closer, I might be able to hear his heart beating. I wondered then if I could hear mine too. But I knew for certain that his heart and mind were beating in sync. They had been since the moment we met. It took us long enough. But I see it now. "Be mine. Officially. You don't need to hide anymore. We don't need anyone's approval." My tears started streaming down my face and I put my lips against his. Yes, when we walked down the hall the next morning, eyes lingered on us, but nobody truly said anything. How could they? My boyfriend was the captain of Walton basketball team. They cannot oppose him even if they wanted to. We swiftly fell into a routine. We would spend 3 pockets of time throughout the day studying in the library. He read me poetry when we were bored and I taught him the lessons he could not quite understand. At times, while I explained, he would not even be listening because he would just be staring at me. "I'm unbelieving that you're mine, Troy," he would say. I would roll my eyes playfully although butterflies plagued my stomach. "Can we focus here, Mr. Webley?" I would reply playfully. "To get a good score on this chem test you might get a reward from your tutor." He smirked at my suggestive remarks and scooted closer to me. I warned them with my eyes as we were after all still in public and the eyes of the librarian were always wandering. The last thing they wanted was to get demerit points because we were doing inappropriate acts in the school library. "Now we're talking," he winked. "Get back to the lessons then. Babe, I'm ready to ace this test now." And ace the test he did. His grades were improving from mid-Bs to As. Our long nights of studying were certainly paying off. Although he was still very much occupied with basketball practice, he was putting a lot more effort in his studies. I suppose being with a nerd influences you and motivates you to study just as hard. I loved having that impact on him. For the most part the school crowd has been accepting. Clark and Jacob were in disbelief at first, unbelieving that I had been harboring my feelings about Neil secretly. But the shower doesn't support and even started being cordial towards Neil themselves. Neil's friends on the other hand seemed indifferent since they were not only finding out that their friend was in a relationship, but also that it was gay. I could imagine that they would be shell-shocked. But surprisingly they went on with their lives and treated Neil as though nothing had changed. The teasing towards me stopped and there was no snickering anymore when I would raise my hand during class. However, Carl Anderson remained quite the antagonist. During games he hogged the ball and did the best he could to not allow Neil to shoot. He wanted to make Neil regret being with me. I suppose you could not stand the idea of his gay captain siding with his gay partner. He felt trampled and he made sure to do the best he could to make Neil's life miserable. However, after being called out by his teammates and reprimanded by the coach, he stopped his basketball sabotage. He then redirected his anger towards me saying sly comments whenever he could. "Nerd," he would mumble when we walked past me in the science laboratory. I was taking advanced lab classes with juniors so we were classmates then with no Neil around to protect me. I felt quite intimidated by Carl. But I did not let him get to me. "You think Neil's serious about you? Think again. He's the basketball captain. He's got looks that girls are pining for and you really believe he'll settle with someone like you?" Delusional. I bit my tongue back and focused on my experiment. When you could not rile me up with his words, he decided to get physical and that was when he accidentally knocked my measuring cylinder, spilling substance all over my workplace and my lab gown. Fortunately another one of Neil's basketball teammates who also happened to be a junior came to my aid. "Anderson, man, what are you doing? Leave him alone." "Man," he said before turning to me. "You good? You tell Neil so he can teach this baboon a lesson." "Thanks," I mumbled, but of course I would not tell Neil. He had too much on his plate already. I would not bother him with yet another problem, especially since our relationship was one of the only things in his life that did not stress him out. Basketball and his education were almost too much. So I was happy to be a sanctuary at night. I would read poems to him while running my hand through his hair. He would be fast asleep soon after, exhausted from a day of classes in basketball. On game days I would write him notes which he had pinned on his locker. I never missed a basketball match now and I always donned his jersey as he requested. Being with him was like a dream at times. I looked at him and wondered how lucky he had gotten. "I love you," I suddenly blurted out. I can't believe I had dreaded coming back to boarding school again because of the idea of a roommate. Then God led me to you. He sat up on his bed and peered up at me. He had been resting his head on his lap as we spoke about how our days went. "I love you," he replied as he put his nose against mine. "I'm even luckier to have you. Thank you for sticking with me despite the difficulty." I must have looked perplexed because he then told me his discovery. Of course, he found out one way or another. He was bound to find out. "I heard Carl's been giving you a tough time." I nodded and looked down at my fingers, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't want to tell you. Too much of a burden. You know. He raised my chin and put his face closer to mine. Hey, you're never a burden to me. I assure you. I never would have let it happen. I knew it won't happen again. Just let him be. Neil, I don't want to be the cause of a ruckus in your team. You're not the ruckus, love. He is, and you don't have to worry about him destroying our team or attempting to undermine our relationship. He's gone. Gone? Neil nodded while the headmaster overheard him slurring some homophobic and remarks about you and me. He was ranting to his friends about he, a junior, was not given the opportunity to lead a basketball team as a captain. Whereas me, a mere sophomore and a gay one at that, was given the chance. Headmaster was aghast to hear him insulting me because of my relationship with you, and it hit a nerve. Apparently the headmaster's son is also gay and he is extremely supportive of his son. He expelled Carl there and then and explained that there was no room for such negativity and discrimination in Walton. Damn, karma worked in mysterious ways indeed. Although a part of me felt bad for Carl. He did deserve what he got. We can be ourselves now. No need to hide here in room 39. No need to pretend to be someone we're not. The world is out there for us to discover and share. We're accepted here in Walton. Our love celebrated. We'll be fine. We'll be more than fine. I agreed. I leaned in for a kiss and leaned our foreheads together, relishing the moment. I took a deep breath and drowned myself in his beautiful eyes. I guess boarding school isn't that bad after all, huh?